So someone got me this one for Christmas, and I love these kind of novelty gifts. I thought it'd be rude not to use it once. Welcome back. I hope you all had a good break. I was really hoping to get some more videos out during December, but December is the busiest time for me. It's where I get the majority of orders in across all the platforms that I sell on. So whilst I was hoping to put some time aside and actually record some videos, just all of the printing, dispatching, customers, just all of that had to take priority. Especially with delivery not being so great this year, so added stress on top of that. But we are back in the new year now, and I'm hoping to do a lot more videos this year and really just boost this channel a lot more. I've also started work on my Lightroom course now, which takes all of the stuff we've been doing on YouTube here, all of the learning, and just expand upon that further, different techniques, detailed things, and a lot of different walkthroughs as well that I won't be putting up here on YouTube. It's something that I've been after doing for a while, so if you are interested in that, then you can follow the link to my website below and sign up just for interest at the moment. And then once it's ready, you'll get a notification. But for now, let's get into this. So I want to go over color grading today. And I'm actually going to split this into two parts. So this video is going to be more about the theory side behind the color grading tool and what you can do with it. And then I'll do another video on its practical application on how you might use the color grading tool to get certain desired effects within a photo. But first of all, what is the color grading tool? So if we go into Lightroom here and we scroll right the way down until we get to the color grading tool here. Now this will be the layout that you usually see, which is you've got three circles. You've got your midtones, your shadows, and your highlights. And you can access this by going up to the three circles button at the top. But if you were to go across between these, you can now open up each one individually from your shadows, your midtones, and your highlights. And what you basically get is all of the same tools down here, but you're able to use them in a little bit more detail. Now, personally, I like working with this, but what I might do sometimes is just go in and try out some different colors so I can quickly access and find the hue that I'm after to actually use within the color grading tool. Once I'm happy with that rough color, then I'll actually pop across into these ones and do those kind of detailed edits. But that's the side of using the color grading tool that I'm going to do in the second part. For this one, we need to understand what is this tool actually doing. Now, you can refer to this tool almost as it being like using a filter. So when you put a filter over a photo, whether you're on Instagram, you select the filter and you get this whole sort of new look to your image. And what's basically happened when you're using those filters there is it's like laying over different colors within certain parts of the image. So if I was to lay over a blue filter with this video right now, this would be different as if I was to put a yellow filter on with this video. Now, if we go back to our raw, we can actually choose to influence this into our shadows, highlights, and midtones. But why can't we do this further up with different colors? What's the difference with this tool? So if we go over into this image here and I go back into all of the global settings for this, if I go over into my shadows and I was to click down into the blues, you can see that straight away you've got this blue wash now over the image. If I take that back to normal, I can double click and that'll bring me right back, and I go over into my highlights and I put the same one down there, I get another blue wash. Now what about if I do both? As I pull this around into the different hues, that starts to influence the colors, and this is where that kind of like filter effect comes into it. Now, at its heart, you are not actually applying these colors to the entire image. Instead, you are applying them to the different regions of the image. So to explain this properly, I like to use a gradient tool. Here you can see you've got your blacks over here, sort of your grays, your midtones, and then you've got your whites, like the highlights on the other side. So if you pop over into the shadows again, and I was to put that blue back in, let's have a look what happens. I'm going to put this right the way across so we can see the maximum effect of it. And I'm also going to come over into my shadows. So I've pulled this all the way down here. Now, if we look at our gradient, we can actually see that the white section of this, the highlights here, is completely untouched. So what we are putting in, it doesn't matter how saturated I make that color or how bright that hue is, it is only going to affect right the way down here. Likewise, if I was to take that back out, and I go over to my highlights, and I pull that all the way down, you can see again It's only on the right side where the whites, the highlights are, that is blue. But if you look closer, you'll notice the white is still present. So why is this not affecting, I've chosen the highlights here, but why is this not affecting all of the white? Now, it's harder to see when you go back into the shadows. If I was to pull this right the way down again, it's harder to see here, and your eyes are just assuming that actually this blue is going right the way across, but it's not. The blacks are also unaffected. Within Lightroom, when we're using this color grading tool, we cannot add color into the whites and the blacks, those brightest and darkest points of the image. We physically can't add the color in. It's harder to see with the shadows, but it was a lot easier once we add it into the highlights. If I wanted to make those brighter parts of my image more white, well, how can I go about doing that? And this is where we need to dive into the tools a bit more. If I go into my actual highlights one here then, I've chosen to do a blue, and within each one we have our hue, saturation, and our luminance. And this is basically mirroring the panel that we have up here with the HSL sliders. So up here we have the ability to manipulate our blues, the saturation and the luminance of them. So if I was to add in my color grade and some blue here, and I go up to my blue for my hue, as I move this up and down, you can't actually see a great deal of difference. If I come back down to here, I can change the hue of the blue that I've added over in the color grading by pulling this around the circle here. And you can see down at the bottom in this area, the hue, your number here is changing as we go with that. Now, next to it, you can see the saturation marker, which currently says 100. If I pull this in closer towards the circle, that marker goes down, and you can see that less of that color is applied. So your saturation is determined by how far you go away from that middle point there. So if we leave that over at 100 at the minute, because that's still not changing anything about this white side, where that's going to come into effect is the luminance. So the luminance is just your brightness of the color. If I pull this all the way down, what we're essentially doing is we're pulling those whites down into more of a gray. And gray is where the color grading actually adds onto. So anything that's gray, the color grading will work. We've still got that defined line of saying, hey, this is the highlights over here. But now, because I've reduced the luminance, you can see the white now has the color grade affecting it as well. If I pull this right the way up though, then we see that the brighter parts of those images come across more, and we actually don't have much being added on. So if you've got an image like this where actually there's a lot of black and white going on in there, some really kind of defined dark and white points, this is where the luminance is going to become key. So if I go back into my highlights and I add in some more blue, and I'll just go 100% again so we can see that. Now you can see that over here, the white buildings that we had before have now got that blue tinge to them, but some of the brightest points, perhaps like the sky up here, doesn't have as much effect in. So now if I reduce the luminance of that, let's have a look at what happens up here. You can see that sky suddenly goes quite blue, but as does everything else in the image. So I'm also reducing the brightest points. Now to find those brightest points, if I boost it up to 100%, I can still see there's some bits up here, the window up top. But if I bring that again down now, this is not an edit I would do, it's just to prove a point of showing you that sometimes you need to be aware of what is the brightest and darkest points in your image. And that kind of editing you're going to do further up. But this slider is great for just bringing in that touch bit more if your photo has too many whites or too many darks in. So if I go the opposite side and we look at the shadows, I can already see there's some darker points drifting down here. So I'm going to go add some blue into the shadows, and as I pull that down, it has the opposite effect, because now I'm making it darker, I'm actually reducing the blues in there. So I need to go the other way. If I come the other way here, you can see that the darkest points have now become more of a grey, they look a bit more washed out, but we can see that colour grading being added in a bit more. So those are your three different things that you have to use then. You've got your hue, your saturation, and your luminance. So if we go back over to our gradient then, we've got a couple more tools down here just to have a look at, which is your blending and balance that we have here. So let's put two different colors into this. Let's go with one color in the shadows and one color in the highlights. And when it comes to choosing what colors you're putting into your color gradient, you can go with color theory. You can also just go by what you actually want to achieve from the image. Do you want it a little bit warmer? Do you want it a bit cooler? But for now, let's just go with some color theory, and let's just go with the opposite ends of the color wheel. So the most common way of using this is that sort of the orange and teal look, or just putting some blue, some cooler tones and some warmer tones in. Because when we look at our color wheel here, we have our blues down on one side and sort of our oranges and yellows up on the other. So in the shadows, I'm going to introduce some blue. I'm going to fully saturate this again, just so we can clearly see what's going on when using this tool. Over in the highlights then, I'm going to go the opposite end of the color wheel, and I'm going to add in that sort of bit of orange there. And you can already see that's a style that's very popular with a lot of images. I'm going to tweak my luminance ever so slightly. So I'm going to make my whites, I want this orange to be like pushed over a bit more. So I'm going to darken them down, but I'm not going to darken it down too much because I still want some of those bright parts. Same with the shadows, but I need to lighten these a bit so I can see that blue coming across. Now the midtones I'm going to leave alone for now, but obviously if you are trying to target the midtones specifically, it's exactly the same tool. So if I went for a green in the middle there, try to find a balance between the two different sides, I can do. But for the purpose of this, I'm just going to leave it alone because I want to clearly show you what this blending and balance tool actually does. So if I take this blending tool then and I was to pull it all the way over here to the left, what we start to see is those colors actually crossing into each other. So you can see some of the orange and yellow over on this side, and you can see some of the blue on that side. But it doesn't look mixed. It doesn't look smooth. It's quite defined between these. If I pull the blending mode all the way over to the other side, then now suddenly it looks like the two colors are merging together and actually blending really nicely. So you want to think about it as you pull over to the 100% sort of side here, you're getting a much more smoother balance between the two colors. If you come over to the other side, it's becoming quite sharp. Now, because I've got no midtones here, I'm going to pull this right across so I've got that nice sort of balance between them. You can go in to each color and you can tweak this individually. The balance one then, if I pull my balance all the way to the left, I've got the darker side of the image, the shadows, the color that I've introduced there, that blue, I've got that dominating. So I'm actually telling Lightroom that, hey, my shadows, I actually want them to go over into the highlights here. So it's completely overtaken the midtones, and you can see that blue has pushed its way across. If I pull my balance to the other side where those highlights are sitting in a minute, you can see the opposite thing has happened now that I've told Lightroom my highlights, my whites, I want that to take over what's going on in this side. Obviously, when we're bringing this in, that kind of defeats the purpose of having shadows and highlights. So having it at 100 doesn't work, but it really depends on, which colors you want to dominate if you're using this tool. The final tool that we've got then in the color grading that we can use is our global one. Now, why would we use a global tool when we've got all of these detailed ones that we can use down here? Is that going back to our filter kind of mode? Is that just the exact same? So I'm going to reset this. I'm going to go over onto our global setting and I'm going to introduce the blue again. Let's see what happens. So surprise, surprise, the blue's just been added everywhere. It's been added in the mids, the highlights and the shadows. Once again, because we're not played around with that luminance, we can't really see it too much. But if I push that way, I can get my darks or my whites. So why might we do this when we could just introduce it up at the top there with the white balance? All this is doing is adding a global tint. So if you're editing your image and you're thinking, okay, maybe I want this to be a little bit cooler, rather than going straight up to the top with your white balance and introducing the temperature changes there, try adding it down here. Because when you start playing around with the white balance, you're screwing around with a lot of stuff. This is purely just that like film we talked about, where you're just taking a piece of colored paper and putting it over your image. That's your tint. When you start playing with the white balance, you're playing with the entire image. So if I bring this one across to here like that, and let us change that across. I'll bring that back up, and then I'm going to go up to my white balance and introduce some of that there as well. So you can see the white balance, it's a lot more aggressive on what's happening. Now I can try and find the balance of like almost the same, but in an entire image, you are messing around with a lot of things beyond just putting that color in. Personally, when I'm happy with the white balance of an image that I've got, but I've gone through my editing process and I think, actually, I just want to put a slight different color over the top of this, just needs that little bit more blue, that little bit more yellow, that's when I will bring in that global setting to use. If we go back over to one of our images here then, and I've got another one that took over in the Christmas markets in York. If I pull my white balance further down here, I can bring in those blues with that, or I can just come down, and actually I quite like a warmer tone on this because there's some nice greens and bits going in. So I'm going to come over here on my global settings and just bring in a tad bit more warmth to that there. And maybe I might think, actually, I just want this on the darker parts of the images, so I'll bring this luminance down. And that's how I can warm up that image and then choose the saturation to have on there. And there we go, I've just brought that sort of extra tint that's going on in there then. That's not what I would do with this photo, it's just again purely to demonstrate how we might use this tool. So the color grading tool is really powerful. And then one last tip, when you're in these different ones here, if you click this arrow above, you'll actually just get access to the sliders if you prefer to use the sliders rather than mess around with the wheel. Personally, I like the wheel because it is a color wheel, so you can visually see like what you're going to be doing to effect, especially if you back over onto all three of them on the screen like this. But also you can toggle on and off any changes you do on each individual wheel with the I button here then. So you can just click and hold that down and you'll see those differences. That's a bit handier to see if you're happy with the shadows, but the highlights you put in, you're not quite sure if it's working. Rather than just toggling on and off the master like settings, you can just go in individually and have a look at each one of them. So whilst there's no specific like image editing going on there, then that's going to be in part 2 to show you how we might use this in a practical setting. Hopefully that's given you a real good theoretical understanding of when you open up this color grading, what's actually happening to your image. I'm very big on understanding the tools behind it, because if you have the knowledge of the tool you're using, then that can help influence your decisions when you're editing, rather than just blindly going in and being like, let's add some color here, let's add some color here, and not actually understanding what's happening in the different parts of your photo. So whilst you're waiting for part 2 to come out, go away and have a play around with the gradient tool, but also open up an image that's got some really defined blacks and whites in there, and just get used to that luminance tool mostly out of the others. Hue and saturation is easy to play around with. The luminance tool is the key here with the color grading. Again, this is a very powerful tool, and the knowledge that you're learning here is not just for Lightroom. You can also transfer it across to programs like Premiere with your video editing. So I hope you enjoyed this. Please do like and subscribe and comment below, and I'll have part 2 out for you very soon.